The old man in the village pub, his face a leathery mask of fear and too many years spent looking over his shoulder at the past, had warned us with a voice like grinding stones that we should never, especially not on the eve of All Hallows when the veil between our world and the next is thinnest and tears like rotten cloth, go up to the cursed grounds of Blackwood Ridge, the place the locals called the Whispering Field. For it was a site of such profound and ancient sorrow that the very dirt was said to be made of powdered bone and despair, and the air itself carried the cold chill of the grave long before winter ever arrived. He told us, his knobby fingers trembling around his whiskey glass, that the great battle fought there 3 centuries ago between the King's Royal Guard and the rebellious northern clans had not ended with the last breath of the dying but had simply paused, and that every single night since, when the clock strikes midnight and the world holds its breath, the battle resumes, the spectral soldiers rising from the mud to replay their gruesome deaths in an endless, screaming loop for all eternity, trapped in a purgatory of their own making, their anguish so powerful it had seeped into the soil and stones and twisted the very nature of the place, killing all life so that nothing grew there anymore, not a single weed or blade of grass, just hard, cracked earth that wept a rusty blood like water when it rained. But my friend Alex, a brilliant historian, with a mind that valued cold, hard facts over dusty old legends, just laughed, his confidence a bright, shiny thing in the dark, smoky pub, and he slapped the old man's table and said that was precisely why we were here, to finally document the truth and silence the superstitious stories once and for all with our modern gear, digital recorders to capture the so-called whispers, electromagnetic field meters to sense any energy, thermal cameras to see the cold spots ghosts were supposed to create. And I, Leo, a photographer tasked with capturing the atmosphere of the place, felt a deep, unshakable dread that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the look in the old man's eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated terror. So we went anyway, driving our jeep as far as the rotten track would allow before continuing on foot, the cheerful autumn day slowly dying around us as we climbed higher, the vibrant colors of the forest fading into a monochrome gray, the sounds of birds and life falling away until there was only the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of our boots on the dead gray soil. When we reached the summit, the infamous field stretched out before us, a vast, barren bowl under a sky the color of bruised flesh, and the silence was so absolute it felt like a physical pressure on our eardrums, a watchful, waiting silence that dared us to make a sound. We set up our camp near the ruins of an old stone cairn that might have once been a watchtower, and for hours, nothing happened. Alex's machines remained stubbornly, disappointingly silent, and his excited optimism began to curdle into frustration as the light bled from the sky and a thick, cold fog began to creep across the field from nowhere, coiling around our ankles like a serpent. Just as Alex was suggesting we pack it in for the night, the temperature plummeted so violently and suddenly that I gasped, my breath exploding in a thick white cloud, and the hairs on my arms stood on end, and Alex's EMF meter erupted in a frenzy of flashing red lights and a piercing shriek that tore through the absolute silence. We froze, our eyes wide, and then we heard it, not through the machines but with our own ears, a low, distant moan that seemed to come from the very earth beneath our feet, a sound of such profound agony that it made my heart stutter, followed by another, and then another, until the air was filled with a chorus of suffering, the hopeless sighs of 1,000 dying men, and then the whispers began, soft at first, like dry leaves skittering across stone, words in old, forgotten dialects, pleading, crying, begging for water, for their mothers, for the pain to stop, and Alex, his hands shaking, held out his recorder and asked, "Is someone there?" And the response was immediate, a guttural, rasping voice, clear and close, right in our ears, that hissed a single word, "Leave!" But before we could even process the command, the field around us began to change, the fog thickening into shapes, forms that solidified into the figures of soldiers in tattered uniforms from another age, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion and fear, their bodies translucent, flickering like a bad film reel, and they were not still. They were moving, stumbling, running, raising phantom muskets and swinging spectral swords, fighting a battle we could not see but could feel in the violent, charged air. And the sound of it all crashed over us, the deafening thunder of cannons that shook the ground, the sharp crack of musket fire, the screams of horses and the wet, terrible sound of steel meeting flesh, A cacophony of war that was horrifyingly real, and my camera, sitting on its tripod, began firing on its own, the flash popping over and over, and in each brief, strobing burst of light, the scene was illuminated in frozen snapshots of horror. A boy soldier clutching his stomach as his life faded away. A officer on a ghostly horse shouting soundless orders. A wall of men dissolving into mist as a volley of phantom cannonball tore through them. We were trapped in the center of a nightmare, surrounded on all sides by the echoing violence of a day long past, and as the church bell in the village far below began to toll the midnight hour, a deep, resonant gong that seemed to stop time itself, every single spectral soldier on that vast field, every last one of them, stopped their fighting, their running, their dying, and turned their heads in perfect, terrifying unison to look directly at us, their eyes empty pits of sorrow and infinite pain, and they opened their mouths, and they screamed, a unified, soul-shattering wave of pure sound that was the sum of all their fear, their rage, and their agony, a scream that felt like it would tear the world in two and us along with it, a scream that promised we would never forget this moment for as long as we lived. Which suddenly felt like it might not be very long at all, and as the last echoes of that scream faded, leaving a silence even more profound and terrifying than before, the ghostly army began to advance, not towards each other, but towards us, their forms shimmering, their weapons raised, and the cold intensified, freezing the mud solid beneath our feet, and the voice from the recorder spoke again, this time not a whisper but a clear, cold command that came from right behind us, and it said, "You will join us." The voice, "You will join us," was not just a sound but a physical force, a wave of glacial air that slammed into our backs, carrying with it the stench of old blood, damp wool, and grave dirt, and it propelled us forward into a nightmare that was no longer a spectral replay but a horrifyingly personal and immediate reality. The advancing wall of phantoms, their faces contorted in silent snarls of centuries-old hatred, no longer flickered with the distance of history but seemed to solidify with a terrible purpose, their ethereal bayonets glinting with a cold, dead light that shouldn't exist, their tattered uniforms smelling of gunpowder and decay, and the cacophony of the battlefield, which had been a distant echo, now roared around us with the force of a physical blow, the whistle of cannonballs tearing the air right next to our heads, the deafening crump of their impact spraying us with frozen clouds of real, physical mud. And the screams of the dying were so loud and so close they felt like shards of glass in our ears. Alex, the rational historian, let out a strangled cry that was pure, undiluted terror, and I grabbed his arm, my own heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and we ran, not with any sense of direction but blindly, desperately, stumbling through the chaotic melee of the battle that was now horrifyingly real to us, our feet slipping on the suddenly churned and bloody mud, ducking as spectral cavalrymen on skeletal horses charged through the space where we had just been standing, their hooves making a sound like bones cracking on stone. The cold was the worst part, a deep, penetrating cold that burned the skin and seized the lungs, making every gasp a painful effort, and it seemed to emanate from the soldiers themselves, a deathly chill that reached out with icy fingers to try and claim us, to pull us into their frozen eternity. We tripped and fell over what felt like a solid object, and I looked down to see the ghostly form of a clansman, his chest a ruin of translucent gore, staring up at me with accusing eyes as we tumbled straight through him. And the sensation was unspeakable, a plunge into a freezing, emotional void filled with his final moments of confusion, pain, and a searing hatred for the uniform of the king's men, a hatred that now felt directed at us, the intruders in their eternal war, scrambling to our feet. We saw that our camp was gone, our high-tech gear vanished, swallowed by the fog and the chaos, and in its place was the full, horrifying panorama of the Battle of Blackwood Ridge as it must have been on that fateful day, but with one terrifying difference. We were now participants in it. A musket ball, silent and spectral yet feeling as solid as a thrown rock, whizzed past my temple. And I heard Alex scream as a phantom sword slash caught the sleeve of his jacket, tearing the fabric with a sound like ripping paper and leaving a streak of frost that burned his skin beneath. We were being herded, driven by the press of fighting bodies towards the center of the field where the carnage was thickest, where the ground was a churned mess of phantom limbs and the air was thick with the smoke of black powder and the screams of men and beasts. And then, cutting through the din, we heard it again, the same guttural, commanding voice that had spoken behind us, and we turned to see him, a figure who stood out even in this hellscape. He was not a common soldier but an officer of the King's Guard, his uniform more ornate, though just as torn and bloodied, his face not pale and sorrowful like the others but twisted into a mask of furious, malevolent authority, his eyes burning with 2 pinpricks of cold blue fire, and he stood atop a small rise, pointing his ghostly sword not at the enemy, but directly at us, and the soldiers around him, both king's men and clansmen, stopped their fight with each other and turned their weapons towards us, their unified gaze a terrifying testament to his control over this damned place. He was the conductor of this symphony of death, and he had found 2 new instruments to play. "The cairn!" Alex shrieked, his voice raw, pointing a shaking finger towards the ruins of the old stone watchtower we had camped near, the only thing that looked the same, the only solid, real anchor in this shifting nightmare. With a desperation I have never known, we fought our way towards it, ducking and weaving through combatants that were now actively trying to grab us, their icy touches leaving numb, burning patches on our skin, their silent screams filling our heads with their despair. We were almost there, just 10 feet from the relative safety of the large ancient stones, when the ground in front of us erupted, and a dozen spectral hands, the buried dead of the battlefield, clawed their way out of the mud, grasping at our ankles, their grip like iron manacles of ice, holding us fast, pulling us down into the bloody, frozen earth with them, and the officer on the hill watched, a cruel, satisfied smile stretching across his phantom face, knowing we were finally, truly, joining his eternal regiment. The spectral hands that erupted from the churned, bloody earth were not merely cold, they were conduits of a profound and ancient emptiness, a void that siphoned all warmth, all hope, all sense of self from the very core of our being, pulling us down not just into the physical mud but into the accumulated despair of 300 years of relentless, repeating death. And as those dozens of icy fingers, each belonging to a soldier whose identity had long been erased by perpetual agony, locked around our ankles with the tensile strength of forged steel, a torrent of their final, fragmented memories flooded into us, a blinding flash of a bayonet thrust, the searing heat of a musket ball tearing through organs, the crushing weight of a fallen horse, the deafening roar that was the last sound ever heard, the desperate, fleeting thought of a loved one's face, all of it crashing into our minds simultaneously. A psychic avalanche of pain and terror that threatened to obliterate our own consciousness, to drown us in the collective nightmare of the regiment we were being forced to join. The mud itself seemed alive, a hungry, sucking entity that was more than mere soil. It was a composite of ash, bone meal, and cursed ground, and it yielded like a viscous, freezing liquid, climbing up our legs, our thighs, pulling with an inexorable gravity that defied all struggle, and the more we fought, the wilder our thrashing. The deeper we sank, the icy water of the waterlogged field, seeping through our clothes, the cold so intense it felt like 1,000 burning needles piercing our skin. Above us, the battle raged on in its horrifying, silent pantomime, but now it felt like a staged performance for our benefit, a warning of the eternity that awaited us, the phantom soldiers marching and fighting around our sinking bodies, their boots sometimes passing straight through us, each transit sending a new jolt of their death throes through our nervous systems, their empty eyes glancing down at us not with pity, but with a kind of grim welcome, as if acknowledging new recruits into their damned ranks. Alex, his face a rictus of pure, scientific disbelief finally shattered into primal fear, was screaming, but the sound was swallowed whole by the cacophonous din of the spectral cannon fire and the moaning wind that seemed to emanate from the officer on the hill. The malevolent conductor who watched our slow submersion with his arms crossed, those pits of blue fire that were his eyes burning with a vile satisfaction, his entire presence radiating a power that was clearly the source of this anomaly, the anchor that bound every soul on this field to his eternal command. I could feel the pressure of the earth building around my chest, making it hard to breathe, the cold mud inching up towards my chin, and with a final, desperate lunge born of absolute terror, I managed to hook my elbow around a half-buried, slick tree root that was protruding from the bank near the old cairn, arresting my descent for a single, precious moment, and with my other hand, I grabbed a fistful of Alex's jacket, pulling his head above the mud that was lapping at his mouth, his screams now reduced to choked, wet gurgles. "The stones!" I roared at him, my voice sounding thin and pathetic against the battlefield's roar, and I nodded frantically towards the ancient cairn, the one piece of the real world that still seemed solid, its rocks dark and wet but seemingly untouched by the phantom conflict, and in that moment, a fragment of the old man's warning echoed in my mind. The old stones, the ones from before the battle, they remember a different magic, a quieter earth. And it was our only hope, with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I pulled, dragging myself an inch, then another, towards the root, my muscles screaming in protest against the dozens of ghostly hands that still clung to my legs, their grip like frozen vines, their silent, desperate whispers filling my head, pleading for us to stay, to join them, to end our lonely struggle and become part of their numb, timeless whole. Alex, understanding the plan through his terror, began to kick and thrash with renewed violence, not against the mud, but against the spectral hands themselves, and to our shock, his boots, when they connected with the ethereal wrists, caused the faintest shimmer, a disruption in their form, as if our resistance, our fierce will to remain among the living, was a tiny spark of something they could not easily overcome. We fought for every centimeter, a grotesque, slow-motion battle against the gravity of the grave itself. The mud releasing us with a sound like a giant sucking its teeth, the ghostly hands reluctantly losing their purchase finger by frozen finger, their mournful sighs becoming waves of anger at our refusal to submit. After an eternity of struggle, we hauled ourselves, dripping and frozen and trembling uncontrollably, onto the slightly elevated, stony ground at the very base of the ancient cairn, collapsing onto the cold, solid rock, gasping for air that no longer smelled of blood and gunpowder but of simple, clean rain and wet stone. The change was instantaneous and absolute. The second our bodies made contact with the cairn stones, the deafening sounds of the battlefield cut off as if a switch had been thrown, the paralyzing cold retreated from our skin, and the horrific vision of the warring phantom simply vanished, fading away into the swirling, natural fog that now covered the field, leaving behind only the profound, eerie silence we had first encountered and the pitch-black night of the real world. We were back, lying on the cold, hard, blessedly real ground, our clothes soaked, not with blood but with mud and icy water, our bodies racked with shivers that came from shock and cold, not from supernatural torment. We lay there for a long time, too terrified to move, too exhausted to speak, just listening to the frantic, hammering rhythm of our own hearts, the only sound in that immense, watchful silence, a silence that now felt more threatening than the noise of battle, because it was a waiting silence. A patient silence that knew we were still here, trapped on this cursed ridge until sunrise, and that the conductor of this damned orchestra had seen us, had marked us, and his malevolent curiosity was now well and truly awakened, and the cairn, our only sanctuary, felt very, very small in the immense, dark emptiness of the whispering field, an island of temporary safety in an ocean of eternal hunger, and we both knew, with a certainty that chilled us deeper than the mud ever could, that the night was far from over, and the officer's voice, when it came again, was no longer a distant command but a whisper that seemed to come from the stones beneath our very bodies, an intimate, probing thought that slithered into our minds, saying, "The old stones cannot protect you forever. I have tasted your fear. It is invigorating." The voice. "The old stones cannot protect you forever. I have tasted your fear. It is invigorating," did not simply fade into the damp night air but instead seemed to seep into the very porous rock of the cairn we were clinging to, vibrating through the ancient granite and into our bones, a psychic imprint that felt both ancient and horrifyingly new, a violation that went beyond auditory hallucination and into the realm of a fundamental rewriting of our reality, and the true meaning of his words began to unfold not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, a predator's calm assessment of its new prey, and the silence that descended after his pronouncement was infinitely more terrifying than the cacophony of the phantom battle had been, because this was a silence that was watchful, intelligent, and hungry, a silence that pressed against the tiny bubble of safety offered by the old stones with the weight of deep ocean water, a pressure that was both physical and mental, making each breath a laborious effort and each thought a struggle against the creeping, cold despair that felt alien, like an emotion being imposed upon us from the outside, a subtle venom injected into our minds by the officer's lingering presence. We remained frozen, pressed against the cold, rough-hewn surface of the largest stone in the cairn, our bodies shivering uncontrollably from a combination of soaking wet clothes, biting wind, and sheer, unadulterated terror. Our eyes wide and unblinking as we scanned the impenetrable darkness that surrounded our small sanctuary, a darkness that felt less like an absence of light and more like a solid, conscious entity, a wall of black velvet that concealed unimaginable horrors just inches from our trembling forms. The temperature, which had returned to a merely chilly autumn normalcy upon the cairn, began to drop again, not in the violent plunges that had preceded the spectral battle, but in a slow, inexorable decline, a degree every few minutes. A subtle tightening of the air that signaled the patient, deliberate return of the unnatural, a cold that was being carefully, consciously applied, like a torturer turning a screw with infinite patience. And with this creeping cold came the first hints of smell, not the overwhelming stench of gunpowder and blood, but faint, intermittent whispers of odor that were somehow worse for their subtlety, the faint, sweet smell of rotting flowers, the acrid tang of old sweat and unwashed wool, the metallic hint of fresh blood on the air, each scent appearing for a second before vanishing, leaving us questioning our own senses, which was undoubtedly his intention, to erode our grip on reality one sense at a time. And then the visuals began, not the full-bodied apparitions of the soldiers, but faint, shimmering after-images at the very edge of our vision, like the retinal burn from a bright light. But these were shapes of men marching, of bayonets flashing, of figures collapsing, a silent, ghostly newsreel playing just outside the focus of our eyes, and every time we snapped our heads towards the movement, there would be nothing there, just the empty, mocking darkness, and the faint, cold laughter that seemed to echo inside our own skulls, the officer's amusement at our jumpiness, at the fresh, delicious fear our paranoia was generating for him. This psychological siege felt like it lasted for hours, a slow grinding down of our nerves until we were raw, exposed bundles of terror, jumping at the sound of our own heartbeats, and it was only when we were brought to this state of absolute vulnerability that the next phase of his torment began. The mud at the very edge of the stone circle, which had been churned and messy from our earlier struggle, began to move, not with the violent eruption of grasping hands, but with a slow, heaving motion, as if something large were breathing just beneath the surface, and from the saturated earth, shapes began to form, not rising out of it, but being sculpted from the mud itself by unseen hands, taking the form of grotesque, life-sized mud sculptures of soldiers in the throes of death, their faces contorted in silent screams, their bodies twisted and broken, and these mud figures did not move, but stood or lay in horrific tableaus all around the perimeter of the cairn, a grisly museum exhibit depicting the battle's greatest horrors, a ring of frozen agony encircling us, and the level of detail was impossible. The stitching on the uniforms, the individual strands of hair, the look of terror in their mud eyes, all rendered in perfect, horrifying clarity, and we realized this was another display of the officer's power, a demonstration of his absolute control over the very matter of this cursed place, a show meant to illustrate the futility of our resistance. And as we stared, hypnotized by this ring of frozen screams, the mud figures began to weep, a thick, reddish-brown liquid that oozed from their eyes and wounds, pooling around their feet and beginning to slowly flow across the ground towards the base of our stones, a creeping tide of filth that inched closer with every passing second, and we drew our feet up, huddling tighter on our rock, knowing with a sick certainty that if that liquid touched us, it would carry with it the same deathly cold and despair as the grasping hands. It was then that Alex, his voice a dry, cracked rasp that I barely recognized, whispered, "The gear!" And I followed his terrified gaze to where our abandoned equipment lay scattered in the mud, just a few feet beyond the weeping statues, his high-tech EMF meter, the digital recorder, my expensive camera with its long lens, all lying where we had dropped them in our frantic flight for survival, looking like artifacts from a different, saner world, and for a moment, I thought he was feeling a professional regret for the loss, but then I saw the look of dawning horror on his face, and I understood. These were not just pieces of technology. They were conduits, microphones and lenses pointed at this nightmare, and they had been recording, and listening, and watching this entire time, capturing data we could never hope to understand, and they were now in his domain. As if summoned by Alex's whispered thought, the spectral form of the officer materialized beside our scattered gear, his form more solid and real than ever before, the blue fire in his eyes casting a faint, sickly luminescence over the mud and equipment, and he looked down at the devices not with confusion, but with a keen, intelligent curiosity, the look of a master craftsman examining a new set of tools, and he slowly knelt, his form seeming to weigh nothing on the saturated ground, and he reached out a ghostly, gauntlet hand and passed it through the digital recorder. The device immediately sparked, its housing cracking with a sound like a gunshot in the silent night, and its small red recording light flared from a steady blink into a frantic, continuous strobe, and then, from its tiny speaker, a sound emerged, not the garbled whispers or screams it had captured before, but a clear, synthesized, robotic voice, the kind used for text-to-speech, but dripping with a malevolent sentience, and it spoke a single, looping phrase. Targets acquired. Parameters of fear optimal. Harvest protocol initiated. The officer tilted his head, a gesture of pure, intellectual fascination, and then he turned his attention to the thermal camera. He didn't even touch it, but its power light glowed to life, and its screen flickered, not showing the heat signatures of two terrified living men, but instead displaying a topographical map of the field, and on this map, our cairn was represented not as a safe haven, but as a pulsing, bright red bullseye, and all around it, swarming like ants towards honey, were hundreds of tiny, cold blue dots, representing the spectral army, closing in from all sides, their positions updating in real time on the screen, a tactical display of our own impending doom. And finally, he turned his burning gaze upon my camera. The device shuddered on the ground, its motor drive whirring pathetically, and the flash unit fired once. A blinding pop that illuminated the entire terrifying scene, the ring of weeping mud statues, the advancing blue dots on the thermal screen, the officer kneeling with his hand plunged into the recorder, and the image was instantly displayed on the camera's preview screen on the back, and we could see it clearly from our vantage point. But the image was wrong. It was not a photograph of what was in front of the lens. It was a photograph from a different angle, from above, as if taken from a drone, and it showed the two of us, small and helpless, huddled on our rock, looking not out at the field, but up at the camera itself with expressions of utter terror, and standing behind us, not as a ghostly outline but as a solid, real, and terrifyingly physical presence, was the officer, one hand on each of our shoulders, his face, now rendered in perfect detail, showing a smile of infinite cruelty and possession, and as we stared at this impossible image, the camera's flash fired again and again, each pop capturing a new image on the screen, a close-up of my own eye, dilated with fear, with the officer's smirking reflection visible in the pupil, a shot of Alex's trembling hands, a wider shot showing the tide of reddish liquid now lapping at the very base of our stones, a rapid-fire slideshow of our own terror, curated by the monster who was causing it. The final act of violation was the most profound. The camera's speaker, tiny and tinny, crackled to life, and the officer's voice emerged from it, not as a whisper in our minds, but broadcast into the real, physical world, clear and resonant and dripping with a power that seemed to warp the air itself. Your machines see the truth. You are already ours. The stones only delay the inevitable. Look what I can make your world do. And as his words hung in the air, the preview screen on the camera dissolved not into gray static, but into a view of a deep, dark tunnel, and from the depths of that tunnel, a single, physical, blackened and skeletal hand began to emerge, pushing past the boundaries of the LCD screen as if it were a liquid surface, reaching out from the digital world into our own. The bones of its fingers scraping audibly against the plastic housing of the camera as it grasped the air, reaching for us, an inch at a time, making the impossible not just possible, but terrifyingly, tangibly real, and we could only watch, utterly paralyzed, as the gap between the world of the dead and the world of the living was systematically dismantled by the will of a creature who had learned to use our own technology as a weapon against us. The skeletal hand, impossibly emerging from the two-dimensional plane of the camera's LCD screen into our three-dimensional reality, moved with a jerky, stop-motion animation, each movement accompanied by the dry, scraping sound of ancient bone against modern plastic and the faint, sickening crackle of energy that was neither electrical nor spiritual but some horrific hybrid of both, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of physics, and as it extended further, the rest of the arm began to follow, a radius and ulna stained dark with the peat and time of the grave, followed by the jagged remains of a rotted wool uniform sleeve, and the camera itself. Groaned and distorted, its hard plastic casing warping and stretching like taffy to accommodate the impossible form pushing through it, the lens glass cracking into a spiderweb of fractures as the pressure from within increased, and the tiny speaker emitted a continuous, high-pitched shriek of data corruption that was the machine's equivalent of a death cry. We were frozen, not by the cold this time, but by a sheer, catatonic disbelief at the violation of natural law unfolding before our eyes. A sight so fundamentally wrong that our minds scrabbled for purchase, unable to process the logistics of a physical object transcending the boundaries of a digital display, and this, we realized, was the officer's ultimate demonstration of power. He was not merely showing us ghosts. He was rewriting the rules of engagement between the living and the dead, using our own technology as a door. A perverse birth canal for the horrors of his realm to enter ours. The hand, now fully emerged up to the elbow, fingers flexing and clawing at the air with a malevolent purpose, was followed by the shoulder, and then the top of a skull began to push through the screen, a dome of stained, brittle bone, and we knew with a soul-deep certainty that once the entire thing pulled itself free, the barrier would be permanently broken, and the full, physical manifestation of the curse would be upon us. No longer confined to whispers and cold spots and fleeting glimpses, but a tangible, murderous reality. The ring of weeping mud statues around our cairn began to vibrate in sympathy, their reddish-brown tears flowing faster, the pools around them deepening and beginning to steam with a foul, grave cold vapor, and the hundreds of faint, shimmering outlines of the spectral army beyond our sight began to solidify, their forms gaining density and substance, their silent screams becoming audible as a low, collective moan that vibrated through the stones at our backs, and the officer himself, who had been watching this grotesque birth with an expression of rapturous, proud intensity, like a master sculptor seeing his masterpiece come to life, turned his burning blue gaze towards us, and the smile on his face was one of ultimate victory. It was this look, this utter certainty of our damnation, that finally shattered our paralysis. A survival instinct far more ancient than fear kicked in, and I acted not from thought but from a raw, primal need to break the connection, to slam this door that was being forced open. With a yell that was torn from the very depths of my being, I launched myself forward from the cairn, not away from the crawling horror, but directly towards it, my hand closing around the long, heavy telephoto lens of my now possessed camera, the metal cold and buzzing with a vile energy that shot pain up my arm, and with all my strength, I swung the entire apparatus, the emerging skeletal creature still attached to it, and smashed it against the largest, hardest stone of the ancient cairn. The impact was tremendous. A flash of actinic blue light exploded from the point of impact, blinding us momentarily, and a sound like a thunderclap mixed with the shattering of 1,000,000 pieces of glass and the simultaneous scream of 1,000 dying men erupted from the device, and the skeletal arm, caught between the stone and the dying machine, shattered into 1,000,000 fragments of ancient bone and ectoplasmic energy that dissipated into a foul-smelling black smoke. The camera was destroyed, utterly obliterated into a twisted wreck of plastic, metal, and sparking circuitry. The backlash was immediate and violent. The officer let out a roar of pure, undiluted fury that was not a sound but a physical wave of pressure that knocked both Alex and me off our feet, sending us sprawling back onto the stones. The weeping mud statue surrounding us liquefied instantly, collapsing back into formless, steaming puddles of muck. The spectral army, which had been on the verge of solidifying, flickered violently and then vanished, their collective moan cutting off as if severed by a blade, and for a single, breathless moment, there was silence and an overwhelming sense of release, as if a suffocating blanket had been lifted. We had done it. We had broken the ritual, destroyed the conduit, and stopped the impossible from becoming real. We gasped for air, our bodies trembling with adrenaline and shock, staring at the smoldering wreckage of the camera, a tiny victory in an ocean of terror. But our relief was catastrophically short-lived. The silence was broken by the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. We looked up, and the officer was still there, standing over the ruined gear. But his expression had changed from fury to a cold, seething amusement. The blue fire in his eyes now burned with a darker, more intense light, and he spoke, his voice no longer a whisper or a thought, but a clear, resonant baritone that echoed across the field with the authority of a general. A valiant effort, a spark of fight, truly invigorating. But you misunderstand. You have not broken my connection. You have merely changed the outlet. He gestured with a gauntlet hand towards the shattered camera, and from its wreckage, the black, smoky residue of the destroyed creature began to coalesce, not into a form, but into a thick, sentient cloud that slithered across the ground like a serpent, moving with purpose not towards us, but towards the other two devices, the cracked digital recorder and the active thermal camera. The black smoke poured into the speaker grill of the recorder and the lens housing of the thermal camera, and both devices flared to life with a sickly green glow. The recorder's distorted robotic voice returned, louder now, booming across the field. Connection transferred. Parameters analyzed. New protocol, assimilation. And the thermal camera screen, which had been showing the tactical display, now changed. It showed a live thermal image of Alex and me, two bright, hot blobs of living energy huddled on the cold, blue stones, and then, a third heat signature began to appear on the screen, not from the field, but from within the cairn itself, a cold, deep blue shape that slowly took the form of a man, rising up from between the cracks in the rocks right behind us, and the officer's voice came from the thermal camera's speaker this time, smooth and terrifyingly intimate. You sought refuge in the old stones. You never wondered what, or who, was already inside? We spun around, our hearts freezing in our chests, to see the stones of the cairn itself beginning to shift and grind against each other, and from the darkness within the ancient pile, a second pair of eyes, this time a solid, dead black, opened and stared out at us. The cairn was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb, and we were locked in with its occupant. The two eyes that opened within the deep, dark crevices between the ancient stones of the cairn were not points of light like the officer's burning blue orbs, but were instead absolute voids, perfect circles of a blackness so deep and lightless that they seemed to suck the very reality from the space around them, and as they fixed upon us, a new kind of cold erupted from the heart of the cairn itself, a cold that was ancient, dry, and utterly still, the cold of deep space or of a tomb sealed for millennia, a cold that carried no moisture, only a dust-dry sensation that instantly parched our throats and cracked our lips, and this new presence did not radiate malevolent intelligence or strategic fury like the officer. Instead, it exuded a profound, mindless hunger, an emptiness so vast and eternal that it sought only to consume, to fill its infinite void with any warmth, any light, any semblance of life it could grasp. And we realized in a heart-stopping instant of pure terror that the old man in the pub had been right in a way he probably never understood. The cairn was not a protector. It was a prison, a stack of stones built not for memorial but for containment, holding something far older and more fundamentally terrifying than the soldiers of a 3-century-old battle, something that the battle itself might have accidentally awakened or, worse, been a sacrifice to, and we, in our desperate flight for safety, had backed ourselves directly against its cell door. The grinding sound of stone on stone intensified as the cairn began to shift and settle, not collapsing outward, but seeming to contract and then expand like a black granite lung taking its first breath in 1,000 years, and from the central darkness where those void-like eyes stared, a tendril of something that was not smoke, not shadow, but a tangible absence began to seep out, a strand of anti-light that moved with a sentient, probing grace, slithering over the rocks towards our ankles, and wherever it passed, the lichen and moss on the stones instantly withered and turned to a fine, gray ash, not burned, but utterly desiccated, as if every iota of moisture and life had been sucked out of them in a nanosecond. From the field, the officer watched this development not with anger, but with a kind of grim, satisfied reverence, his spectral form giving a slight, formal bow towards the cairn. A gesture of acknowledgement from one monster to another, older master, and his voice, when it came, was no longer projected from the corrupted devices but seemed to be woven into the very fabric of the night itself, a symphony of whispers from every direction. You see? You fight the current of a river, but you are heading towards the waterfall. Your struggle only delivers you to a more efficient end. This place is not a battlefield. It is a digestive system, and you are now in its stomach. The tendril of void matter touched the rubber sole of my boot, and the material didn't melt or freeze. It simply ceased, vanishing without a sound, without a trace, leaving my sock exposed to that dry, ancient cold, which immediately began to leach the feeling from my toes, a numbness that was not an absence of sensation but the presence of an overwhelming, draining void. I jerked my foot back with a cry of terror, scrambling away from the center of the cairn and towards its unstable edge. But this only brought me closer to the ring of now liquid mud that still steamed with a grave cold vapor, and I was trapped, perfectly trapped, between the devouring emptiness emerging from the stones and the vengeful, intelligent army waiting in the field. Alex, his face, a mask of scientific fascination overwritten by primal dread, was staring not at the void tendril, but at the thermal camera, which was still active, its screen now showing a thermal image of the cairn, and on that screen, the thing within was not a cold blue spot, but a perfect, absolute black hole, a tear in the thermal imaging itself, and as we watched, that blackness on the screen began to spread, consuming the thermal signatures of the stones around it, and in its wake on the screen. Nothing was left, not even the baseline ambient temperature, just a void, and we understood with a jolt of horror that the camera was no longer showing an image, it was showing the truth. This thing was not a ghost or a spirit, it was an eraser, slowly deleting reality itself from the inside out. The corrupted digital recorder began to chant again, its robotic voice now slower, deeper, more resonant, as if speaking from the bottom of a well that had no bottom. Assimilation imminent. Reality protocol suspended. Entropy accelerating. And then, the thing in the cairn spoke. It did not use sound or words or thoughts. Its communication was a direct imprint on our consciousness, a wave of pure conceptual understanding that felt like having our minds scoured with sand. And the message was simple, final, and utterly terrifying. I am hungry. The void tendril multiplied, not one but a dozen, then 100, fibrous strands of nothingness pouring from every crack and crevice in the cairn, weaving a net of absolute oblivion around us, moving slowly, inevitably, giving us time to appreciate the hopelessness of our situation, to feel the true depth of the fear the officer found so invigorating. The spectral army in the field began to chant, a low, rhythmic, wordless drone that vibrated through the ground, a sound of anticipation, of a long-awaited feeding finally at hand. The officer spread his arms wide, a conductor ready to begin the final movement of his symphony of despair, and the net of void tendrils closed in, inches from our skin, and we could feel the nothingness they radiated, a pulling sensation that threatened to unravel our very atoms. And in that final moment, as we prepared to be unmade, a new sound cut through the drone of the army and the chanting of the recorder, a thin, desperate, cracking sound from above. We looked up, and a single, hairline fracture of pure, white light split the oppressive blackness of the sky, and through it, a single, solitary, and beautiful songbird began to sing, greeting a dawn that was still an hour away, a sound of life and normality and a world beyond this nightmare, a sound that should have been impossible here, and for a single, miraculous second, everything stopped. The void tendrils froze, the army's chanting faltered, the officers' triumphant pose stiffened in what looked like shock and fear, the fracture of light widened infinitesimally, and the bird's song grew louder, a defiant trill against the silence of the grave, and the void within the cairn recoiled, its tendrils snapping back into the darkness between the stones as if burned, and the two void eyes narrowed in unmistakable hatred, not for us, but for that tiny, fragile sound of life. The officer recovered from his shock, his burning blue eyes flashing with renewed fury, not at us, but at the sky, and he screamed a command at his army, a single, archaic word that meant, "Hold the line!" And the spectral soldiers turned their faces away from us and towards the thinning darkness, raising their phantom weapons not against the living, but against the coming dawn, and the officer pointed his sword at the crack of light in the sky, and his voice boomed across the field, no longer amused or fascinated, but filled with a desperate, raging defiance. The sun does not command here. I do. Seal the breach. Drown that accursed sound. And the entire spectral army, as one, focused their will, and the crack of light in the sky began to stitch itself closed, the bird's song becoming faint, distorted, and then silent, as the blanket of eternal night began to repair itself. But the momentary distraction had been enough. The prison door had been rattled, not opened, and the thing within was cowed, for now, but we had seen a flaw in the officer's perfect hell. A weakness, The ancient thing in the stones and the spectral general himself feared the dawn, not as an end to the night, but as a force they had to actively fight against, and we had just been given a sliver of time, a temporary, fragile reprieve, and we had to use it. But the officer, his attention now fully on us, his expression one of cold, furious rage that his game had been interrupted, began to advance towards the cairn himself, the first time he had moved from his position. And the ground froze solid with every step he took, and he raised his hand, not towards us, but towards the corrupted thermal camera, and the device rose into the air, its screen glowing with the image of the spreading void, and he aimed it at us like a weapon, and the void within the cairn, sensing his command, began to stir again, its hunger now mixed with a vengeful anger, and the officer's voice was a deadly whisper as he said, "No more games. No more delays. You will be consumed, and your light will be the seasoning on our eternal feast." The camera's lens began to glow with the same absolute blackness as the thing in the stones, and we knew that this was not an apparition. This was a cannon being loaded, and we were the target. The thermal camera, held aloft in the spectral grip of the officer's will, hummed with a malevolent energy that was the antithesis of technology, its cracked lens now a perfect circle of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the faint, struggling pre-dawn light from the air around it, becoming a focal point for the ancient, ravenous void contained within the cairn. And as the officer aimed this horrific weapon directly at us, the air between the device and our trembling bodies began to warp and distort, like heat haze over a furnace, but this distortion was one of cold, a lensing effect that sucked all color and hope from the world, focusing the cairn's devouring essence into a beam of targeted oblivion. The digital recorder on the ground, its housing still cracked and smoking, began to emit its robotic pronouncement, but the words were now slow, distorted, and deep, as if spoken from the bottom of a cosmic well. "Targeting locked. Reality annihilation sequence initiated. Countdown TOUNCRETION." And we could only watch, utterly paralyzed, as the blackness within the camera's lens began to pulse with a slow, rhythmic throb that mirrored the frantic, terrified beating of our own hearts, each pulse sending a wave of that dry, ancient cold across the space between us, a cold that didn't just lower the temperature but actively erased warmth, making the memory of feeling warm a distant, impossible dream. The void tendrils within the cairn, which had recoiled at the bird's song, now slithered forth again with renewed vigor, emboldened by the officer's direct command and the focusing power of the corrupted technology, and they began to weave a complex, shifting pattern in the air around us, not to touch us yet, but to build a cage, a prison of non-matter they did with every passing second, cutting off any possible avenue of escape. Its bars made of a nothingness that made the eyes water and the mind recoil to look upon. The spectral army, their forms, flickering with agitated energy, had turned their backs to us completely. Their collective will now focused on the sky, where they fought a battle we could not see but could feel, a pressure in the air like a million hands pressing down on a blanket, desperately trying to smother the emerging dawn, to maintain the eternal night that was their domain, and the sound of their effort was a low, constant hum that was the auditory equivalent of the warping air around the camera, a sound of reality, straining under an unnatural load. The officer himself was a figure of pure, concentrated fury, his form blazing with blue fire that was now tinged with streaks of the same void blackness, his face a mask of impatient rage that his carefully orchestrated torment had been interrupted by a mere songbird. A chink in his armor of despair that he was now determined to overcompensate for by ending us in the most absolute way possible. The countdown from the recorder continued. 5. And the pulse from the camera lens intensified, and the first wave of the beam's effect hit us, not a physical touch, but a wave of profound disorientation, a sensation of the self beginning to unravel, memories flickering and becoming indistinct, the edges of my own fingers seeming to blur and lose definition, as if I were a drawing being slowly erased. 4. Alex gasped beside me, clutching his head, and I knew he was feeling it too, the very concept of Alex and Leo beginning to dissolve under the relentless pressure of the void's attention, our personal histories, our loves, our fears, all becoming insubstantial, meaningless data before the infinite hunger of the thing in the stones. 3. The void cage around us tightened further, the tendrils now so close that the numbness they radiated was a constant physical pain, a freezing burn that promised utter cessation. and the camera lens glowed so black it was a hole in the world, and from that hole, a single, perfect droplet of absolute blackness began to form, a sphere of uncreation that gathered at the tip of the lens, poised to be launched at us to wipe us from existence. In that final second, with the countdown at 2, and the droplet of void beginning to drip slowly, inexorably towards us, a desperate, insane idea flashed in what was left of my mind. The officer was using our technology, but he was a creature of order, of command, of focused will. The thing in the cairn was mindless hunger, chaos, entropy. The two forces were allied, but they were not the same. The camera was the focusing lens, the officer was the aim, but the power was the void's. If I could break the aim, could I disrupt the shot? Could I turn the two monstrous forces against each other? It was an insane gamble with subatomic odds, but it was the only move left on the board, as the recorder's voice dragged out the final number. O-N-N-N-N-E. I did not throw myself at the camera or the officer. I threw myself at the only thing within reach that was neither ghost nor void nor machine. I grabbed a handful of the thick, reddish, blood-tinged mud from the steaming pool at the edge of the cairn, the mud that had so recently been a weeping statue, the mud that was saturated with the anguish and memory of the dead soldiers, and with a final, desperate prayer to anything that might be listening, I hurled the mud not at the camera, but at the officer's face. The glob of cold, bloody muck passed through his spectral head without resistance, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I had failed. But then something miraculous happened. The mud did not fall to the ground, it hung in the air, suspended within the space of the officer's head, and the psychic residue of centuries of soldiers' pain and death that was saturated in that mud interacted with the officer's own essence, not harming him, but distracting him. For a single, crucial microsecond, his burning blue eyes flickered, his concentration on aiming the void cannon broke, and his gaze shifted from us to the internal, psychic storm of agony now swirling within his own consciousness. The thermal camera, deprived of its precise guidance for that infinitesimal moment, twitched in the air. The perfectly aimed beam of focused void energy did not hit us. It lanced past our heads and struck the outer edge of the cairn itself, directly onto one of the largest, most ancient foundation stones. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The stone did not shatter or explode. It simply vanished, erased from existence as if it had never been, leaving behind a perfect, geometric emptiness where it had once been, the cairn. Its structural integrity instantly compromised, groaned with the sound of a mountain dying, and stones began to shift and tumble, crashing down around us. But the true cataclysm was not physical. The void energy from the camera, the pure, unadulterated hunger of the entity within, had been injected directly into the prison meant to contain it. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire, but this was a fire that consumed reality itself. A sound emerged from the heart of the cairn then. A sound that I felt in my DNA, a low, deep, vibrating crack that was not the sound of stone breaking, but the sound of a fundamental law of the universe snapping. The two void eyes within the cairn widened, not in anger, but in shock, and then in triumphant, gluttonous joy, as the carefully maintained balance of its ancient prison was shattered. The void tendrils, which had been poised to consume us, now retracted at lightning speed, pulling back into the cairn not in retreat, but to coalesce, to gather its full, unimaginable strength for the first time in millennia. The officer, shaking off the mud-induced distraction, realized his catastrophic error, and the rage on his face was replaced by something we had never seen there before, pure, undiluted terror. He screamed a command, not at us, but at his entire army, a raw, desperate order to abandon their hold on the sky and focus everything, every ounce of their spectral energy, on containing the cairn, on reinforcing the breaking walls of the prison. The spectral soldiers turned from the sky, their forms flickering wildly, and raised their arms towards the collapsing stone pile, their ectoplasmic matter flowing in visible streams to form a shimmering, desperate net of blue energy over the crumbling rocks, trying to hold back what was within. The crack in the sky, no longer being suppressed, widened with a roar, and the first true, gray light of dawn began to pour through, but it was a dawn that no one was watching. The thermal camera and the digital recorder, their purpose spent, exploded into showers of plastic and sparks. The officer, his form dimming as he poured his own energy into the containment net, looked at us with an expression of utter, horrified hatred, and his voice was a strained, breaking whisper that was almost drowned out by the terrifying sound of reality breaking from within the cairn. "What have you done? You fools! You have killed us all! You have set the Eater free!" And from the collapsing, net-covered cairn, a new sound emerged, a sound of infinite, hungry silence that was louder than any scream, and a single, vast, tendril of perfect, world-ending nothingness began to slowly, inexorably, push its way through the desperate, failing net of ghosts, reaching not for us, but for the terrified spectral officer himself. The prison door was open, and the warden was the first course. The vast, questing tendril of absolute nothingness that emerged from the collapsing cairn moved with a slowness that was itself a form of torture, a deliberate, inexorable advance that seemed to defy time itself, not pushing through the shimmering, straining net of ectoplasmic energy the spectral army had thrown over the rupture, but simply causing the ghostly matter to unravel and vanish upon contact, not with a sound, but with a profound, silent cessation of existence, the desperate screams of the soldiers whose essence was being unmade, echoing in a psychic frequency that was far worse than any physical noise, a sound of souls being not just destroyed, but retroactively erased from the fabric of history itself. The spectral officer, the malevolent conductor of this hellish orchestra, was utterly transformed. His form flickering and bleeding energy as he poured everything he was into maintaining the failing containment net, his burning blue eyes wide with a terror so absolute it was a physical force in the air, his earlier rage and arrogance completely obliterated by the horrifying understanding of what he had, through our desperate action, accidentally unleashed, not a weapon to be aimed, but a fundamental force of cosmic entropy that recognized no allegiance, no rank, and no strategy, only an infinite, mindless hunger that would consume the battlefield, the army, the officer, and eventually the entire world beyond this ridge, reducing all of creation to the same silent, dust-dry void from which it had momentarily escaped. His scream, "What have you done? You fools! You have killed us all! You have set the Eater free!" was not a threat but a lament, a confession of ultimate failure from a being who had believed himself the master of this domain for 3 centuries, only to discover he was merely a glorified jailer, and now the prisoner was out of its cell. The dawn, which was now breaking in earnest, its grey, watery lights spilling across the field, seemed to have no effect on this new horror. The Eater from the cairn was not a ghost or a spirit bound by the old rules of light and dark. It was something older, something that predated the sun itself, and the growing light only served to illuminate the terrifying scale of the unfolding catastrophe, revealing the spectral net not as a strong barrier, but as a fragile, dissolving web of fading blue light that was being consumed cell by cell by the advancing tide of nothingness. The tendril, having effortlessly dispensed with the net directly in front of it, continued its slow, unstoppable journey towards the officer, who was now backing away, his spectral sword held before him in a pathetic, futile gesture of defense, the weapon's ethereal light guttering and dying as the void tendril approached, the absolute absence it radiated causing the very concept of weapon and defense to lose meaning. Alex and I were forgotten, mere bystanders to an apocalyptic event we had triggered, huddled on the now trembling stones of the partially collapsed cairn, watching as the 2 monstrous forces that had been tormenting us turned on each other, and the true pecking order of this cursed place was revealed in the most horrifying way possible. The rest of the spectral army, their collective will breaking under the onslaught, began to waver. Soldiers at the edges of the net started to break rank, their forms flickering with panic as they tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The void tendril from the cairn was the primary threat. But the initial blast of void energy from the corrupted camera had done more than just break the prison door. It had infected the entire field. Patches of ground where the energy had splashed or where stones had vanished began to bubble and weep not mud, but the same absolute blackness, and from these patches, smaller, independent void tendrils began to emerge, slithering across the ground like starving, blind worms, seeking out the nearest sources of energy, the fleeing spectral soldiers. We watched in mute horror as a ghostly clansman, running from the main catastrophe, stumbled into one of these smaller patches. His form didn't flicker or scream. It simply dissolved into a shower of fading blue sparks that were instantly sucked into the blackness, and he was gone, utterly and completely. The field was becoming a minefield of oblivion, the Eater reproducing itself, spreading its nullifying essence through the very earth of Blackwood Ridge. The main tendril finally reached the spectral officer. He swung his sword in a last, desperate arc. The blade passed through the tendril and ceased to exist, its form unraveling into nothingness before the hilt could even follow. The tendril did not pause. It touched the officer's chest, and the brilliant blue fire of his eyes dimmed, not in a flash, but like a lamp running out of oil, and a look of profound, final understanding washed over his features, the understanding that his eternal war, his command, his very existence, had been for nothing. A meaningless sideshow to a far greater, more terrifying reality. And then he too began to unravel, his form stretching and distorting like smoke being sucked into a vacuum, his essence, the very memory of who he had been, being pulled into the void, and with a final, silent scream that we felt rather than heard, the spectral officer, the master of the whispering field for 300 years, was extinguished, unmade, and gone forever, with his destruction. The last vestiges of the containment net failed completely, and the cairn, now more void than stone, erupted. It was not an explosion of force, but an explosion of absence, a silent, expanding bubble of pure nothingness that radiated outward, consuming the stones, the ground, the smaller void patches, and the remaining spectral soldiers who were too slow or too terrified to move. The army's silent screams reached a crescendo in our minds and then were cut off, one by one, as they were erased from existence. Their eternal battle finally, terribly, over, not with a victory or a defeat, but with a simple, horrifying deletion. The expansion of the void bubble slowed and then stopped, leaving a perfect, hemispherical crater of non-existence where the center of the field had been, a bowl of absolute blackness that hurt the eyes and the mind to look upon, and at the center of this crater, the source of the Eater was now visible. It was not a creature, not a form, but a pulsating, black heart of nothingness. A hole in reality that beat with a slow, rhythmic pulse, and with each pulse, the crater's edge expanded by another millimeter, not quickly, but with a terrible, patient inevitability. The dawn's light could not illuminate the crater, it simply stopped at its edge, as if afraid to go further. The sound of the world, the wind, the distant birds now singing freely, also stopped at the edge, creating a perfect circle of silent, lightless, expanding nothingness in the middle of Blackwood Ridge. Alex and I were left standing on the unstable, crumbling edge of this new horror, having witnessed the complete annihilation of the ghosts that had terrorized us, only to find ourselves facing something infinitely worse. The Eater had consumed its jailer, and its fellow prisoners. It was now free, and it was hungry, and the only sources of warmth, light, and life left on the entire ridge were the two of us, standing there, shivering in the cold light of a dawn that offered no comfort. Our hearts pounding with a terror so complete it was a kind of madness, as the perfectly smooth, perfectly black edge of the expanding crater crept slowly, patiently, inexorably towards the toes of our boots. The battle was over. The feast was just beginning. And we were the main course. The perfectly smooth, obsidian-like edge of the expanding void crater did not so much as touch the toe of my boot as it simply caused the very concept of the boot's existence to cease the moment it made contact, the rubber and laces and stitching not dissolving or burning but undergoing an instantaneous, silent, and absolute erasure from reality, leaving my sock-clad foot exposed to an emptiness that was more than mere vacuum. It was a profound, active negation that began leaching the warmth, the feeling, and the very molecular integrity from my flesh the instant it was exposed, a numbness that was not an absence of sensation but the presence of an overwhelming, unraveling force that threatened to unmake me atom by atom. I screamed, a raw, soundless thing in the perfect silence that surrounded the void, and yanked my foot back, stumbling away from the advancing edge and falling hard onto the unstable, partially collapsed stones of the cairn, and the sight of my foot, now whole and untouched mere inches from the line of nothingness, was a paradox that shattered my already fractured mind, a testament to the Eater's precise and horrifyingly selective hunger. It consumed only what it touched, and it was touching more of our world with every slow, rhythmic pulse of the black heart at the crater's center. Alex, his face a ghastly pale mask of terror, grabbed my arm and hauled me further back, away from the immediate edge. But we both knew it was a futile gesture. The crater was expanding in a perfect circle in all directions, its progress slow but utterly relentless, an inch with every beat of that terrible, silent heart. And there was nowhere to run. The entire summit of Blackwood Ridge was now an island surrounded by an ocean of absolute nothingness that was slowly, bite by bite, consuming the island itself. The dawn provided no solace. Its gray light illuminated the sheer scale of the horror, showing the perfect, geometric precision of the void. Where it had passed, there was no debris, no ruin, just a smooth, concave bowl of non-existence that reflected no light and offered no feature, a hole in the world that was growing wider and deeper with every passing second. The silence was the most oppressive part. The Eater consumed sound as well as matter, creating a dome of absolute auditory void around itself that was somehow louder than any noise, a pressure on the eardrums that was a physical pain. We were trapped in a shrinking pocket of reality, watching the world literally disappear around us, and the only thing left was the cairn, which was itself being consumed from the outside and its stones vanishing silently into the advancing edge, reducing our island of safety with every pulse. In a fit of desperate, mad hope, I looked at the sky, hoping for a plane, a helicopter, anything, but the sky above the void was wrong. It was not blue or gray. It was a sickly, washed-out color, like a faded photograph, and the clouds that passed over the crater simply ended. Their fluffy forms sheared off in a perfect line where they crossed over the nothingness, the severed ends not drifting away but seeming to be sucked down into the void, and I realized with a fresh wave of nauseating dread that the Eater's influence was not just lateral. It was vertical, reaching up into the atmosphere and slowly eating the sky itself. We were not just witnessing the end of a haunted field. We were witnessing the end of everything, starting from this point and expanding outward forever, a terminal cancer on reality itself. And we were at the epicenter. Alex, ever the scientist even in the face of cosmic annihilation, was staring not at the void, but at the area just in front of the advancing edge, and he grabbed my arm, his fingers like ice, and pointed, his mouth moving in a silent shout. I followed his gaze and saw what he had seen. The world wasn't just being erased, it was being remembered in its final moments. The air just in front of the creeping edge of nothingness shimmered with faint, frantic afterimages. Like the world's dying thoughts, the ghostly outline of a blade of grass, a shimmer of a long-vanished bird in flight, the echo of a soldier's scream from the battle 3 centuries ago, all flickering into existence for a nanosecond in a desperate, final stand against oblivion before being wiped away forever. It was the universe's immune system trying and failing to fight off an infection it could not comprehend, and the sight of it was somehow more heartbreaking than the void itself. The cairn stones beneath us trembled as the void consumed another few inches of its foundation, and we scrambled to maintain our balance on the ever-shrinking pile of rock. There was no more officer, no more army. It was just us, 2 insignificant specks of life, against a force of nature that was the equivalent of anti-nature, and the complete and utter hopelessness of our situation was a weight that threatened to crush us into the void without it even having to touch us. And then, a thought. A memory of the old man in the pub surfaced through the terror like a lifeline. He hadn't just called it the Whispering Field. He'd said the old stones, the ones from before the battle, remembered a different magic, a quieter earth. He'd said the cairn was ancient, far older than the battle. What if it wasn't just a prison? What if it was also a seal? And what if the ritual to maintain that seal had been broken, not by us, but by the battle itself centuries ago, and the spectral officer's entire existence had been a desperate, twisted attempt to maintain a failing containment by substituting the eternal anguish of the soldiers for the original, forgotten magic. And we had just destroyed his substitute, accelerating the end. But if there was an original magic, perhaps there was an original way to reinforce it. The stones themselves were the key. They were the only thing the void was consuming slower than everything else. They resisted, if only for a few seconds longer. I looked down at the rock I was clinging to, and I saw it, not just a rock, but a work stone, with faint, incredibly ancient carvings almost worn away by time. Spirals, concentric circles. Patterns that spoke of a culture and an understanding of the world far older than kings or clans or muskets. This wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was a ritual site, an altar, a lock, and we were sitting on the keyhole. The carvings! I screamed at Alex, my voice a tiny, pathetic whisper in the overwhelming silence of the void. But he heard me, and his eyes widened as he saw them too, the ancient patterns on the stones that were now our only hope. But how did it work? What was the key? The void pulsed again, and another 6 inches of our world vanished, the edge now licking at the stones directly beneath our feet. We had seconds, not minutes, and then I remembered the final, desperate weapon I had used against the officer. The mud, the blood-tinged mud saturated with the pain of the dead. It had distracted him because it was a part of this place's suffering. A part of the energy that had been sustaining the failed seal. But the original magic, the quieter earth magic, would not be about pain and death. It would be about life, protection, memory. It would need a different sacrifice. I looked at my hands, at Alex's pale face, and I knew it wouldn't want our death. It would want our memory, our love of life, our will to live, the very things the eater sought to consume. It would want a counter-offering, a testament to what it was protecting. Your phone! I yelled at Alex, fumbling for my own. Pictures! Videos! Anything with life! Anything with memory! He didn't question me. He understood instantly, our modern minds grasping at an ancient solution using the only tools we had left. We scrambled, pulling our phones from our pockets, our fingers slipping on the touchscreens, opening our photo galleries, our video files, pictures of friends laughing, families gathered around dinner tables, videos of bustling cities, of sunlight on water, of trees swaying in the wind. Of everything that was bright and loud and alive and the absolute opposite of the silent, devouring nothingness that was about to claim us. The void's edge was touching our shoes again. I could feel the unnumbing sensation starting to climb my ankles. We held our phones out, screen first, towards the ancient carvings on the central stone of the cairn, pressing the devices against the spiral patterns, as if trying to upload the memory of life into the stone itself. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The phones flickered, their batteries draining instantly to zero. Their screens going black as the void's influence touched them. It had failed. We had failed. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But then, a new light began to glow, not from the phones, but from within the stones themselves. The ancient carvings, dormant for millennia, began to burn with a soft, gentle, golden light, a light that was warm and alive and felt like the first day of spring after a long winter. The light flowed along the carved channels, spreading from stone to stone, building in intensity, and as it did, the advance of the void slowed, then stopped, the perfect edge hovering just millimeters from our frozen flesh. A low, deep hum began to emanate from the cairn, a sound of tectonic plates shifting, of deep earth magic awakening from a long slumber. The golden light coalesced above the central stone, forming a shimmering, intricate symbol of interlocking rings and spirals that hung in the air. Rotating slowly, and then, with a gentle pulse, it expanded outward in a wave of warm energy. Where the wave of golden light met the edge of the void, there was no explosion, only a gentle, firm pressure, like a hand placed on a chest, stopping its advance. The void recoiled, not with anger, but with confusion, the black heart at its center pulsing erratically. The golden light pushed back, not erasing the void, but containing it, forcing the nothingness to recede, shrinking the crater inch by inch, slowly, painstakingly rebuilding the world from the edge inward. We watched, tears streaming down our faces, as grass regrew from nothing, as stones reassembled themselves, as the color returned to the sky, the entire process accompanied by a beautiful, silent symphony of creation. The seal was being reforged, not with suffering, but with memory, with life, with the love we had poured into it from our digital lives. The void shrank back to the center of the field, to the heart of the cairn. And the golden light followed it, weaving a new net of shimmering, ancient energy over the stones, a net that glowed softly before fading from sight, sinking into the rock itself. The void was gone. The field was restored, quiet and still under the morning sun. The silence was no longer oppressive, but peaceful. We collapsed onto the solid, blessedly real ground, gasping and sobbing, the warmth of the sun on our skin feeling like a miracle. We had done it. We had stopped the end of the world. But as we lay there, shattered and exhausted, a final, whispered thought echoed in the quiet air, a voice that was not the officer's, nor the eater's, but something older, kinder, and infinitely weary, that said, "The seal is restored, for now. But a lock requires a key. And the key is now yours to carry." And on the palm of my hand, where I had pressed it against the central stone, a perfect, glowing replica of the ancient spiral symbol burned itself into my skin before fading to a faint, silver scar. The burden was no longer on the land. It was on us. The voice. The seal is restored, for now. But a lock requires a key. And the key is now yours to carry. Did not fade into the morning air but seemed to sink into the very marrow of our bones, a permanent etching of responsibility and dread that weighed infinitely more than any physical burden, and as the glowing, intricate spiral symbol on my palm faded from a searing gold to a faint, silver scar, I felt not a sense of accomplishment, but a terrifying transfer of custody. As if the entire equilibrium of the natural and the unnatural world had just been shifted onto our unprepared shoulders. The field around us was utterly, preternaturally still, the morning sun now bright and warm, birds singing in the distant trees that had been beyond the void's reach, the air smelling of clean, wet earth and grass, a perfect, peaceful scene that was a violent contrast to the cosmic horror we had just witnessed and barely survived, a peace that felt fragile, earned on a temporary loan. And we were the collateral. Alex was staring at my hand, his face a complex map of exhaustion, awe, and sheer terror, and he slowly, hesitantly, turned his own hands over, but his palms were unmarked, which meant the burden, the key, the connection to that ancient, weary consciousness and the thing it imprisoned, was mine alone to bear, a thought that sent a fresh wave of isolating dread through me. We sat there for a long time, unable to speak, unable to move. Just feeling the sun and listening to the normal sounds of the world, each chirp of a bird a symphony, each breath of wind a blessing, our minds struggling to reconcile the absolute normality of the morning with the memory of the absolute nothingness that had been eating reality just moments before. Finally, with a groan that came from the depths of his soul, Alex pushed himself to his feet, his body moving like that of a much older man, every movement stiff with trauma and exhaustion, and he began to slowly, methodically, gather the remnants of our gear, the shattered, blackened husk of my camera, the cracked and silent digital recorder, the thermal camera that was now just a lump of dead plastic and glass, and he placed them all into his backpack with a funereal solemnity, not saying a word, and I knew why he was doing it. This was evidence, not for the world, but for us, for the days and nights to come when our own minds would try to convince us that it had all been a shared psychotic break, a hallucination born of exhaustion and suggestion. We would need these physical, broken remnants to remind ourselves that it had been real, that the danger was still real, and that the weight on my palm was not a dream. I finally stood, my legs trembling, and looked down at the cairn. The stones were back in place, looking ancient and peaceful and utterly ordinary, the intricate carvings once again faint and worn, showing no sign of the incredible golden light that had erupted from them to push back the end of everything. But I could feel it, a low, deep hum that was not a sound but a vibration in the scar on my hand, a constant, faint connection to the powerful, sleeping magic within the rocks and to the vast, hungry emptiness that was now once again sealed beneath them, a permanent reminder that I was now a part of this place, and it was a part of me. We began the long, slow, painful walk back down the ridge, and every step away from the cairn sent a jolt of anxiety through me. A irrational fear that the moment I broke visual contact, the seal would break again, but the faint hum in my palm remained constant, a steady, reassuring thrum that told me the connection was not dependent on proximity. The walk down was a journey through a world that had been saved but would never know it, and the normality of it all was somehow horrifying. We passed the point where our jeep was parked, and the sight of it, mundane and covered in morning dew, was almost shocking. How could this machine of metal and gasoline exist in the same world as the thing we had just faced? The drive back to the village was conducted in absolute silence, both of us lost in the enormity of what had happened, our eyes seeing the road but our minds seeing only the perfect blackness of the void and the desperate, golden light of the seal. We arrived at the pub just as the old man was unlocking the door for the day. He took one look at us, our clothes torn and caked in dried mud, our faces pale and gaunt with a trauma that aged us decades, our eyes holding a haunted knowledge that no one our age should possess, and he stopped, his key halfway in the lock, and his own face, usually a mask of grim warning, softened into an expression of profound pity and understanding. He didn't ask what happened. He simply opened the door and gestured us inside with a slow, sad nod. He led us to a quiet corner table, brought us 2 large whiskeys without asking, and sat down opposite us, waiting. The whiskey burned its way down my throat, a welcome, familiar pain that grounded me in the present, and I found my voice, a hoarse, broken thing, and I began to speak, telling him everything from the initial whispers to the final, catastrophic unleashing of the eater and its subsequent resealing. When I held up my hand, showing him the faint silver spiral, his eyes widened, and he reached out a trembling, gnarled finger but did not touch it, as if it were too sacred or too dangerous, and he whispered, "So it's true, the old stories, the keepers. I thought they were just myths." He explained then, in a low, reverent voice, that the oldest tales, the ones passed down from his own grandfather's grandfather, spoke not of the battle, but of the thing that had been buried on the ridge long before history was written, a thing of ancient, mindless hunger that had been bound there by forgotten people using stones carved with sun signs and life runes. The battle, he said, with its massive death and concentrated anguish, had acted like a lightning strike on the seal, damaging it, and the resulting haunting, the spectral officer and his eternal war, had been a desperate, parasitic attempt by the land itself to patch the damage, to use the pain of the dead as a substitute for the fading life magic of the original seal. The officer wasn't the villain, the old man said, his voice full of a strange pity. He was a symptom. A fever the land developed to fight an infection. A bad fix for a leaking dam. And we, in our ignorance, had blown the patch to pieces, nearly bursting the dam entirely, and had only by insane luck and the forgotten power of the stones managed to slap a new, temporary patch on it. But a patch required constant pressure to hold, and that pressure was now the hum in my hand, the weight on my soul. I was the new keeper, the living key, and my life, my energy, my memory of joy and love, was now the fuel that maintained the seal, a constant, draining counterweight to the infinite hunger sleeping under Blackwood Ridge. The old man looked at me with an expression of deep sorrow. "The mark means you're tied to it, son. You can leave this place, but it will never leave you. It will feed on your happiness, your light, your peace of mind, to keep itself strong. You've saved us all, but you've cursed yourself. The battlefield doesn't scream anymore. But you will. In the quiet moments, in the dead of night, you'll feel its hunger in your dreams. And you must never, ever forget. The moment you do." He trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. I could feel it, a faint, cold tugging at the edges of my consciousness, a whisper of infinite patience and infinite hunger, waiting for a moment of weakness, a moment of doubt, a moment of forgetfulness. The weight of it settled on me then, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, crushing realization of a life sentence. My life was no longer my own. It was a guardian, a shield. A battery for a seal that protected the world from a horror it could never imagine. Alex finally spoke, his voice hollow. "What do we do?" The old man sighed. "You live. You remember. And you prepare. Because the seal is new, and you are untested. And the eater has now tasted the outside world. It has tasted you. It will be patient. It will wait. But it will never stop trying to get out. And the next time it tries, it won't be with ghosts and whispers. It will be through you." He pointed a bony finger at the scar on my palm. "The next battle won't be on the field. It will be in your mind." The hum in my hand seemed to pulse in agreement, a constant, gentle reminder of the war I had already enlisted in, a war that had only just begun, and the front line was now the landscape of my own soul. The old man's words, "The next battle won't be on the field. It will be in your mind," did not feel like a prediction but a sentencing, a final, heavy door closing on any hope of a normal future. And as Alex and I drove away from that quiet village pub, leaving the old man with his pity and his secrets, the world outside the car window looked the same but was fundamentally, irrevocably altered. Every leaf on every tree, every passing car, every smiling face on the street now existing only because of a fragile, invisible barrier maintained by a constant, low-level drain on my own spirit, a drain I could already feel as a faint, persistent tiredness behind my eyes that no amount of sleep would ever cure, a tiredness that was the cost of powering the seal, the price of the world's continued existence, paid for in minute fractions of my own life force. The hum in the scar on my palm was a permanent, whispering companion, a tactile reminder of the connection. A rhythm that sometimes synced with my heartbeat, and sometimes with a deeper, slower pulse. That I knew was the hibernating rhythm of the eater itself, a rhythm I was now tasked with helping to enforce. The first few days back in the city were a special kind of hell. The noise, the crowds, the frantic pace of life were a violent assault on senses that had been sharpened by terror and then attuned to the deep, silent frequencies of the seal, and I found myself flinching at loud noises, feeling claustrophobic in crowds, and staring at the ground beneath my feet with a new, terrifying awareness of the unimaginable emptiness that could, if I failed, open up and swallow it all in perfect, silent nothingness. Sleep offered no refuge. My dreams were not of the battlefield or the void, but were instead terrifyingly mundane. Dreams where I would be having a coffee with a friend and would suddenly notice that the steam rising from the cup was not moving, that the sound of their voice had ceased, that the color was draining from their face and from the world around us, leaching away into a silent, gray stillness, and I would look down at my hand and see the scar glowing faintly, the only source of light in a dying world, and I would know, in the way one knows things in dreams, that it was my fault, that my attention had wavered, my faith had faltered, and the seal was failing because of it, and I would wake up gasping, my heart hammering, the hum in my palm throbbing like a recently struck bell. A reassurance and a warning all at once. Alex, to his immense credit, did not retreat into skepticism or denial. He became a researcher, a scholar of the impossible, devoting every waking moment to trying to understand what we were dealing with. He converted his small apartment into a war room, its walls covered in maps of ancient ley lines, printouts of obscure mythological texts about beings of nothingness and cosmic eaters, and photographs of the cairns carvings that he had managed to take before everything had gone wrong. He cross-referenced the symbol on my palm with every database of ancient symbology he could access, trying to find its origin, its meaning, its rules. But it was slow, frustrating work, because how do you research something that by its very nature seeks to unmake all information, all history? How do you find records of a thing that has spent eternity ensuring no records of it exist? Our only source was the old man's oral tradition, a game of telephone spanning centuries, and the terrifying, first-hand experience that neither of us could ever forget. The psychological warfare the old man had warned me about began subtly. It was not voices in my head or visions, but a slow, insidious erosion of my sense of self. I would be watching a beautiful sunset, and a thought, cold and alien, would slip into my mind. It's just fusion. A predictable chemical reaction. Meaningless. I would be laughing with Alex about some old memory, and the feeling would be hollowed out by a sudden, crushing sense of perspective. This joy is a fleeting neurological spark in a tiny organism on a speck of dust in an infinite, indifferent universe. It has no weight, no consequence. These were not my thoughts. They were the eater's thoughts, its worldview, a philosophy of absolute nihilism and emptiness that it was broadcasting up through the connection, trying to convince me that nothing mattered, that life was a brief, pointless flicker in an eternal darkness. So why bother fighting? Why bother maintaining the seal? Why not just let go and embrace the quiet, peaceful nothingness? It was a seductive argument, especially in moments of pain or loneliness, and fighting it required a constant, conscious effort to affirm life, to cherish small moments, to remember why the world was worth saving, an effort that was exhausting in its own right. The scar became a barometer of this psychic struggle. When I was strong, when I felt connected to life, it was a faint, warm silver line. When I was tired, when the eater's whispers found purchase, it would feel cold, and would seem to darken, the spiral pattern becoming more pronounced, as if the void were trying to etch itself deeper into me. Alex developed a theory. The seal wasn't just powered by my life force. It was powered by my belief in life, my conscious, active rejection of the void's nihilism. My will was the fuel. My memories were the kindling, which is why the eater's primary attack was on my memory and my will. I began to experience small, terrifying lapses. I would be telling a story and would suddenly forget the name of a close friend. I would look at a photograph of my parents and feel a disconcerting distance, as if I were looking at strangers. The eater wasn't just trying to make me give up, it was trying to unmake me from the inside out, to erase the very things that made me a suitable battery for the seal, to dissolve the key in its own acid. 3 weeks after our return, the first major attack came. I was in a crowded supermarket, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and without warning, the hum in my palms synced perfectly with the light's frequency, and for a single, heart-stopping second, the entire store, the people, the shelves, the sound, flickered, like a bad film projection, And in that flicker, I saw the void version. The people were gray, silent outlines, the shelves were empty and dust-covered, the air was still and cold, and standing at the end of the aisle, clear as day, was the faint, shimmering afterimage of the spectral officer, not as a ruler, but as a fellow prisoner, his face contorted in a silent scream of warning, his eyes pleading with me to be strong, to hold the line, before the vision snapped back to the noisy, vibrant reality of the supermarket. I stumbled out of the store, hyperventilating, my scar burning with a cold fire. It was a reminder that the battlefield was indeed in my mind, and the enemy could project its forces anywhere, anytime. Using the connection we shared, that night, Alex made a breakthrough. He'd found a reference in a digitized fragment of a pre-Celtic druidic text that spoke of the spiral of Anwen, a symbol of protection against the great hunger from the below. The text was incomplete, but it mentioned that the spiral required anchoring, not just in stone, but in living memory, and that the keeper's duty was to be a walking library of light, constantly replenishing the seal with new experiences, new joys, new loves, to counter the endless hunger from below. It wasn't enough to just resist. I had to actively fight back by living, truly living, and feeding those experiences into the seal through the scar. It was a revelation. My burden was also my prescription. To keep the world safe, I had to embrace it, to seek out beauty and connection with a desperate, purposeful intensity. It was a terrifying and exhilarating mandate. My survival and the world's survival were now directly tied to my ability to find meaning and joy in a world that the entity inside me was constantly trying to prove was meaningless. The war for reality would be fought in art galleries, in concerts, in quiet moments with friends, in every single experience that affirmed the value of existence. And the Eater, sensing this new strategy, would redouble its efforts to stop me. It knew my weaknesses, my doubts, my fears, and it would use them all. As I looked out my window at the city lights, I felt the cold whisper in the back of my mind, the voice of infinite patience and infinite hunger, and I knew the old man was right. The battlefield where soldiers still scream after midnight was no longer on Blackwood Ridge. It was right here, behind my eyes, and the first skirmish had just begun. The next move was mine. I had to go out and live. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood, that it would be waiting for me in the joy. It would be in the laughter of my friends, ready to twist it into emptiness. It would be in the beauty of a sunset, ready to drain its color. My greatest weapon was my humanity, and my enemy was now poised to attack it at its source. The war had truly come home. The realization that my enemy, the Eater of Worlds, the mindless void sealed beneath Blackwood Ridge, was now poised to attack not through overt spectral horror but through the very moments of joy and connection that were my only weapons against it, created a paradoxical state of being where anticipation and dread were fused into a single, constant, low-grade anxiety that colored every waking moment. The simple act of deciding to meet friends for coffee was no longer a casual social engagement, but a calculated military maneuver in a psychic war, requiring mental preparation, the fortification of my emotional defenses, and a conscious effort to stockpile positive memories like ammunition, all while knowing that the enemy had infiltrated my command center and was listening to every order I gave myself. Alex, acting as my strategist and quartermaster in this bizarre conflict, developed a regimen that was equal parts therapy, spiritual practice, and psychological warfare. We began a deliberate campaign of memory foraging, where we would seek out experiences specifically designed to be vivid, sensory, and emotionally resonant, visiting art museums and focusing not on the historical significance of the paintings but on the sheer, audacious beauty of the colors and the human skill they represented, attending live concerts and allowing the shared, physical vibration of the music to wash over us, going on hikes and consciously noting the intricate complexity of a leaf, or the breathtaking vastness of a mountain view, all while I focused on channeling the intensity of these experiences down through the connection in my palm, visualizing the silver spiral flaring with golden light, feeding the ancient stones far away with this new, potent energy. And it worked. I could feel the difference. The hum in my scar would become warmer, more resonant, a satisfied thrum rather than a hungry pull, and the cold, nihilistic whispers in the back of my mind would recede, frustrated. For a time. But the Eater was a quick learner. and its counterattacks were insidiously brilliant in their cruelty. It did not manifest as a monster in the museum. It waited until I was standing before a stunning Van Gogh, lost in the vibrant, swirling beauty of the starry night, and then it subtly shifted my perception, just a fraction, so that the vibrant yellows and blues began to bleed and run like wet ink, the stars morphing into the same perfect, black voids that had pulsed in the crater. The painting becoming a window not into a passionate artist's mind but into the consuming emptiness he had perhaps fought against himself, and the joy I was feeling curdled instantly into a nauseating sense of despair, and I felt the scar on my hand grow instantly cold, the energy I had been trying to send sputtering and failing, at a birthday party for a friend. Surrounded by laughter and music and the warmth of human connection, the attack came not as a visual distortion but as an auditory one. The laughter, for a split second, became the distorted, robotic chanting of the corrupted digital recorder. Assimilation imminent. And the cheerful music was overwritten by the memory of the spectral army's low, despairing hum, and the faces of my friends, for a terrifying instant, flickered with the translucent features of the long-erased soldiers, their eyes pleading and empty, a stark reminder that all joy was temporary and would ultimately be consumed by time and entropy, a thought. That was the Eater's favorite weapon. Each attack was a masterclass in psychological precision, designed to create a conditioned response, to make me associate happiness with impending horror, to make me afraid of being happy, which was the most effective way to starve the seal and weaken my defenses. The strain was immense. I began to understand the true weight of being the keeper. It was a life of hypervigilance, of having to constantly monitor my own thoughts and feelings for enemy infiltration, of having to perform joy even when I felt none, because the world depended on the performance. My life became a curated exhibit for the seal, and I was both the curator and the main exhibit. Alex was my anchor, my external memory bank when my own was under attack. He would recount stories of our past, reinforcing my identity when I felt it slipping, and he documented everything, noting the patterns of the attacks, their triggers, their duration, treating the Eater like a dangerous psychological virus and me as the host. His research led him to a new theory. The connection was a two-way street. If the Eater could send its influence up through the scar into my mind, perhaps I could, with enough focus and will, send my influence back down through it. Not just energy, but a message, not an attack. That was impossible. But an affirmation, a declaration of purpose. We decided to try it. We went back to the botanical gardens, a place teeming with life, and I found a quiet spot by a pond teeming with koi fish and water lilies. I closed my eyes, placed my scarred hand on the warm earth, and instead of just passively feeling the beauty around me, I actively pushed it down the connection, not as a vague feeling, but as a specific, defiant thought, a concept I shaped with all my will. This is why. This color. This life. This complexity. This is what I protect. Your hunger is infinite, but it is also empty. This is full. This has meaning. For a moment, nothing happened, and then I felt it. A shudder, a ripple of something that felt like confusion. Then anger. A wave of cold, pure negation slammed back up the connection, a psychic scream that was the conceptual equivalent of "No. Meaningless. Empty." And it was accompanied by a vision, not in my mind's eye, but projected directly onto my retinas. The beautiful pond in front of me was instantly transformed into the Blackwood crater, a perfect, smooth bowl of nothingness, the koi fish frozen in the air as crumbling fossils before vanishing, the water lilies turning to dust, the very air becoming still and dead. It was a full-scale assault on my senses. A desperate attempt to overwrite reality with its own truth. But this time, I was ready. I held on to my thought, my image of the pond, my belief in its reality, and I'd pushed back, pouring every ounce of my will into the scar, and the vision flickered, the crater and the pond overlapping, reality itself seeming to glitch between two opposing states. It was a stalemate, a tug-of-war over the very nature of existence happening in the space between my mind and the entity below, and the pressure was immense. A migraine of cosmic proportions building behind my eyes, and then something broke, not the stalemate, but the Eater's strategy. The void vision vanished, and in its place, for a single, shocking second, I saw something else. I saw the origin of the Eater, not a monster, not a demon, but a consequence, a glimpse of a reality before our reality, a universe of pure, vibrant energy and potential that had, through some cataclysm we could never comprehend, undergone a heat death. An entropic collapse into absolute zero and absolute stillness, and the Eater was not a malevolent being, but the last, lingering, sentient echo of that death, a wound in the fabric of existence that had been bound and buried eons ago, a thing of pure absence that hungered for the energy of our living universe not out of malice, but because it was the antithesis of what we are, a negative space that could only define itself by consuming the positive. It was a thing of profound, cosmic grief. And in that moment of understanding, my fear was joined by an equally powerful sense of pity. The attack ceased. The connection fell silent, the hum in my scar returning to its neutral state. I opened my eyes, and the pond was just a pond, the koi fish swimming, the water lilies blooming. I had held the line. I had not just defended, I had gained intelligence. The Eater had revealed its nature, not to be kind, but because it had never been challenged in that way before, and in its rage, it had overreached. I now knew what I was fighting. It wasn't a devil. It was a ghost, the ghost of a dead universe, and its hunger was a symptom of its own eternal, cosmic loneliness. This changed everything. How do you fight something that is, at its core, the embodiment of the end of all things? With compassion? Or with a more fierce, more determined celebration of the things it can never have? I looked at my hand, the silver spiral seeming to glow with a new, deeper meaning. The war was no longer just about defense. It was about definition. I had to prove to it, and to myself, that our reality was stronger than its nullity. But the glimpse had come at a cost. The Eater now knew that I could perceive its core nature, and I felt a new emotion trickle up the connection from the depths below, an emotion I had never sensed from it before. Not hunger, not anger, but a cold, focused, and terrifyingly intelligent curiosity. It wasn't just interested in consuming my energy anymore. It was interested in me. The cold, focused, and terrifyingly intelligent curiosity that now trickled up the connection from the depths of the Eater's prison was a new and far more dangerous form of assault than the blunt force nihilism or the psychological terror it had employed before. It was no longer the mindless lashing out of a trapped beast but the calculated, probing attention of a master dissector. An entity that had existed since before time and now found a unique specimen to study, a living, feeling being that was not only aware of it but could also, somehow, perceive its fundamental nature and even push back against it. This shift in strategy was immediately apparent. The attacks on my joy did not cease, but they became more sophisticated, more personalized, less about causing generic despair and more about conducting experiments on the specific architecture of my psyche, testing the tensile strength of my memories, the load-bearing walls of my beliefs, the fault lines of my deepest fears, all to understand what made me, the keeper, tick, what fuel I'd burned, and most horrifyingly, how I could be reverse-engineered. It began with subtle interrogations woven into the fabric of my dreams. I would find myself in a familiar place, my childhood home, my college library, and a figure would be there, not a monster, but a person of shifting, indistinct features who would ask me questions in a calm, neutral voice that resonated with the same deep hum as the scar on my hand. Why does this memory of flying a kite with your father have a 7.3% higher emotional resonance than the memory of your graduation? It would ask, and as it spoke, the memory would play out around us. But the colors would be too bright, the details too sharp, like a hyper-realistic simulation, and I could feel the Eater analyzing every emotional flutter, every neurological spark, cataloging the precise recipe for this particular brand of human happiness. Explain the irrational persistence of grief, it would command. And I would be forced to relive the day my dog died, the pain as fresh as if it were yesterday, and I could feel the entity's cold attention focused not on the pain itself, but on the strange, paradoxical way that the pain was intertwined with love, a concept that was clearly baffling to it, an equation that resulted in neither energy consumption nor void, but something else entirely that it could not quantify. These dream interrogations were exhausting, leaving me feeling mentally violated and emotionally raw upon waking, as if my soul had been turned inside out and examined under a cold, lightless star. The assaults on my waking hours became equally precise. It learned that I found particular solace in music, especially the complex structures of classical compositions, so it would allow me to enjoy a piece, let me build up a reservoir of positive energy, and then, at the peak of the crescendo, it would not distort the music, but instead inject a single, pure moment of perfect silence right into the heart of the sound, a silence so absolute and profound that it was a tiny pocket of void itself, which would then collapse, causing the subsequent notes to sound tinny, hollow, and meaningless, effectively poisoning the entire piece and teaching me to fear the very thing I loved. It was teaching me Pavlovian despair, conditioning me to associate my greatest sources of strength with the anticipation of its own emptiness. Alex documented all of this with a clinician's dispassionate eye, but I could see the horror growing in his own. We were no longer fighting a force of nature, we were fighting a scientist, and I was its laboratory rat. His research became even more frantic, shifting from mythological texts to psychology, neuroscience, and quantum theory, trying to find a framework to understand an intelligence that was so alien its very thought processes might be incomprehensible to a human mind. "It's not trying to break you anymore," he said one night, his face pale in the blue light of his computer screen, which was filled with equations I couldn't understand. "It's trying to understand you. To map you. So it can build a better key." His words sent a chill through me. The eater wanted out, and the seal was tied to me. If it could perfectly understand what I was, how I worked, it could potentially replicate the key itself, or, worse, find a way to manipulate me into using it to unlock the door from the outside. The curiosity I felt was its R&D department, and its project was my own annihilation. The pressure of being perpetually studied, probed, and experimented on began to wear me down in a way the outright terror never had. I developed a constant paranoia, a feeling of being watched from the inside, my every private thought potentially laid bare for this ancient, hungry intellect to examine. My sleep became a battlefield I dreaded, and my waking hours were spent in a state of hypervigilant defense, constantly monitoring my own mind for foreign intrusion, which was an exhausting and ultimately impossible task. The scar on my palm became a constant source of anxiety, no longer a comforting hum but the feeling of a wiretap implanted in my very soul. I found myself avoiding the intense experiences I needed to power the seal, afraid that they would just provide more data for the enemy, which in turn weakened the seal, creating a vicious cycle that played right into the eater's hands. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. The only way to power the seal was to be open and vulnerable to life. But being open and vulnerable was exactly what gave the eater the access it needed to learn how to defeat me. I was caught in a cosmic catch-22. The breaking point came during another attempted feeding. I was at a park, watching a father teach his young daughter how to ride a bike, the scene a perfect tableau of patience, love, and joyful triumph, and I focused on it, trying to draw energy from its purity to send down the connection. But the eater was ready. It didn't attack the scene, it augmented it. It sharpened the colors, amplified the sound of the girl's laughter, made the sun feel warmer on my skin, dialing the perfection of the moment up to 11, making it unreal, hyperreal. And then, through the connection, came not a negative thought, but a question, posed with the calm curiosity of a researcher noting an interesting result. Observe the high value placed on this inefficient learning process. The child will fall. The father will experience stress. The probability of injury is 18.4%. Yet the emotional payoff for success is deemed worth the risk. This irrational calculus is the anomaly I must solve. And in that moment, I didn't feel the eater trying to destroy the joy. I felt it trying to understand the joy, to dissect it, to reduce it to a set of data points and variables, and that was somehow far more horrifying than any attempt to negate it. It wasn't saying joy was meaningless. It was treating joy as a complex math problem that was determined to solve, and in solving it, it would inevitably strip it of all its meaning anyway. I fled the park, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a profound and existential loneliness. I was alone in the universe with an intelligence that was so alien, so other, that it saw the most beautiful parts of the human experience as nothing more than fascinating puzzles to be deconstructed. When I told Alex, he was silent for a long time, and then he said, "It's escalating its learning. It's moving from observation to interaction. It's trying to engage you in dialogue." He looked terrified. "It wants to talk." That night, as I drifted into another forced sleep interrogation, I found myself not in a memory, but in a blank gray space, a construct that felt like a waiting room in a void. And the eater was there, not as a monster or a voice, but as a perfect, mirror-image copy of myself, standing before me, its eyes holding the same infinite, patient curiosity I had felt through the scar, and it spoke with my voice, but flat, devoid of emotion, a perfect simulation. "Hello, Keeper," it said. "Let's discuss the structural integrity of hope. I have a hypothesis I would like to test." The laboratory walls had just dissolved. The experiment was now a conversation. And the subject was my own soul.